A shattered beginning. The delivery room buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the promise of new life. Marianne Green lay exhausted yet radiant, her dark curls damp with perspiration against the pillow. She cradled her newborn daughter, Lily, against her chest. Tiny fingers curled instinctively around Marianne's thumb, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt perfect. The rhythmic beeping of monitors was a background melody, drowned by the sound of Lily's first cries. Marianne's husband, Eric, stood by her side, his face glowing with pride as he leaned in to kiss his wife's forehead. "She's beautiful," Eric whispered, brushing his hand across Lily's tiny head covered in soft black curls. Marianne smiled through her exhaustion. "She's perfect, isn't she?" But as the nurse wheeled Lily to the corner for her post-delivery examination, Eric's demeanor shifted. His proud smile faded into a shadow of confusion. He took a step closer to the nurse, narrowing his eyes. "Excuse me," Eric said hesitantly, gesturing toward his daughter. "Her skin, why does it look darker?" The nurse, a seasoned professional with years of experience, glanced at Eric and shrugged. "Sometimes newborn skin tones can change as they grow, sir. Completely normal." Eric stepped back, visibly uncomfortable. His gaze darted between Lily and Marianne. Marianne noticed his expression but dismissed it as exhaustion. She was too focused on her newborn, already imagining their future filled with love and laughter. Hours later, as Marianne rested in her hospital bed, with Lily sleeping soundly in her arms, Eric's unease became impossible to ignore. "Marianne," he said, his voice low but sharp, "we need to talk." Marianne looked up, her joy dimming. "What is it, Eric?" He hesitated, then blurted out, "Who is the father of this baby?" Her heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "Look at her skin." Eric's voice cracked, his frustration evident. "She doesn't look like me. She doesn't look like us. Tell me the truth, Marianne. Were you with someone else?" Marianne's chest tightened as her mind scrambled for words. "Eric, I don't know why you're saying this. Lily is yours. She's ours. You know how much we wanted her. How can you even suggest?" "Stop lying," Eric shouted, his voice echoing in the sterile hospital room. "I trusted you, Marianne. But this I can't ignore." Before Marianne could respond, Eric grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Marianne sat in stunned silence, her world crumbling around her. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched Lily closer, the baby's soft breaths a fragile anchor in the storm of emotions raging within her. The following days were a blur of grief and confusion. Eric didn't return her calls or texts. When Marianne finally returned home, she found his side of the closet empty, his belongings gone. A handwritten note sat on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this. Don't contact me." Marianne's hands trembled as she read the words. How could the man she'd loved for years abandon her so quickly? Had their marriage been so fragile? And yet, beneath her heartbreak, questions gnawed at her. Why did Lily look so different? Marianne tried to push the doubts aside. She focused on caring for her daughter, pouring all her energy into building a routine. But every glance at Lily's tiny face brought a mix of overwhelming love and unsettling questions. Weeks turned into months, and life found a tenuous rhythm. Marianne returned to teaching, juggling work with single motherhood. Friends and colleagues offered support, but whispers followed her everywhere. "Did you hear what happened with Marianne? I heard her husband left her. Something about the baby." Marianne held her head high, refusing to let the rumors break her. But late at night, when the house was silent, she stared at Lily's crib and wondered if she could ever uncover the truth. The breakthrough came on a crisp autumn morning when Marianne decided to run a DNA test. She'd avoided it for months, fearing what it might reveal. But she owed it to Lily and herself to know the truth. Weeks later, the results arrived. Marianne's hands shook as she opened the envelope, her breath hitching as she read the words. "Paternity excluded. Eric Green is not the biological father. Her world tilted, but the next line sent her heart racing. Father identified. Mark Dawson. Mark Dawson. The name rang a distant bell, but it wasn't one she associated with love or infidelity. A quick online search left her reeling. Mark Dawson was a convicted murderer serving a life sentence in a nearby prison. Marianne stared at the screen in disbelief, her thoughts a tangled web of fear and confusion. How could this be? Had the fertility clinic made a mistake? Was there more to Mark Dawson's story than the headline suggested? One thing was certain. The truth was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined, and uncovering it would require Marianne to confront her past, her fears, and a man she'd never met, but whose presence now loomed over her life. The search for truth. Marianne stared at the computer screen, her breath catching in her throat. The name Mark Dawson glared back at her, highlighted in bold across the search results. Each click unearthed article after article, painting a picture of a man whose life had spiraled into infamy. The headlines were grim. Mark Dawson convicted of brutal murder. Dawson sentenced to life without parole. No justice for the victim's family. A case that shook the town. But as Marianne read deeper, doubt began to creep in. The details of the case seemed murky. The prosecution's timeline was full of gaps. The weapon was never found. Witness testimony conflicted with physical evidence. The articles mentioned a single, shaky eyewitness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Mark fleeing the crime scene. The witness later recanted their statement but was pressured to testify anyway. Mark had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Marianne sat back in her chair, her mind racing. How could a man with no prior criminal record suddenly commit such a violent act? Why did his DNA match her daughter's? She looked over at Lily, who lay in her playpen, giggling at the soft toys dangling above her. Her tiny hands reached for a stuffed giraffe, her dark eyes shining with innocence. Marianne's heart ached with love and confusion. "What have I gotten us into, Lily?" she whispered. "The fertility clinic." The next day, Marianne decided it was time to confront the fertility clinic. She strapped Lily into her car seat, packed a bag of essentials, and drove to the sprawling building that had once represented hope and new beginnings. Now it felt like the epicenter of her confusion. The receptionist greeted her with a polished smile that faltered slightly when Marianne announced her purpose. "I need to speak with someone about a serious error in my treatment." "Do you have an appointment, Mrs. Green?" "No," Marianne replied firmly. "But this can't wait." After a tense silence, the receptionist motioned for her to take a seat. Minutes felt like hours as Marianne rocked Lily in her arms, steeling herself for the confrontation. Finally, a woman in a crisp white coat emerged, her name tag reading Dr. Elise Carter. "Mrs. Green, please follow me." Dr. Carter led Marianne into a sterile office, its walls lined with certificates and accolades. Marianne wasted no time. "My daughter's DNA results show that her biological father is Mark Dawson, a man I've never met. He's currently in prison, and I need to understand how this happened." Dr. Carter's professional smile wavered. "Mrs. Green, I can assure you our clinic adheres to the highest standards." "Clearly not," Marianne interrupted, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "I trusted this clinic with something deeply personal, and now my life is in shambles. My husband left me. My daughter's heritage is tied to a convicted murderer. Explain that." Dr. Carter sighed, folding her hands on the desk. "We'll need to review your records and investigate. This could take time." "How much time?" Marianne demanded. "Several weeks at least. There's a process we have to follow." Marianne's frustration boiled over. "I don't have weeks. This is my child's future we're talking about." Dr. Carter looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "I'll escalate this personally. Please leave your contact information, and I'll ensure someone follows up with you soon." The investigation begins. Feeling dismissed but determined, Marianne contacted a private investigator, James Howard, the same afternoon. James was a tall, unassuming man with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor that put Marianne at ease. He listened carefully as she recounted her story, his notepad filling with scribbled notes. "This is a mess," James admitted after she finished. "But it's not impossible to untangle. I'll start by looking into the clinic and their procedures during your treatment. I'll also dig into Mark Dawson's case. If there's even a chance he was wrongfully convicted, it's worth exploring." "Do you think he's innocent?" Marianne asked. James shrugged. "I've seen enough to know things aren't always what they seem, but I don't jump to conclusions without evidence." That night, Marianne lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her, but Lily's soft breathing in the crib beside her reminded her why she had to keep fighting. Mark Dawson. A week later, James called with an update. "I've arranged for you to meet Mark Dawson." Marianne's stomach flipped. "Meet him? In prison?" "Yes, if you want answers. He's the one who can give them to you. I've already cleared it with the warden. It's up to you." The thought terrified her, but Marianne agreed. Days later, she found herself sitting in a cold, sterile room with a plexiglass barrier separating her from the man whose DNA was inexplicably tied to her daughter. When Mark entered, Marianne was struck by how ordinary he looked. Short cropped hair, sharp cheekbones, and piercing blue eyes that seemed tired but alert. He sat down, picking up the phone on his side of the barrier. "You're Marianne Green?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Yes," she replied, gripping the phone tightly. "And you're Mark Dawson?" "Last I checked," he said, a flicker of dry humor crossing his face. Marianne hesitated, then blurted out, "You're Lily's biological father." Mark blinked, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry." "What?" She explained everything. The fertility treatments, Lily's birth, the DNA test. Mark listened in stunned silence, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When she finished, he exhaled sharply. "This is insane. I didn't even know my DNA was used for anything like that. I've been in here for years." "Did you ever donate to a fertility clinic?" Marianne asked. "No," Mark said firmly. "Never. They must have taken my DNA without consent." "But why?" Marianne leaned forward. "I don't know. That's why I'm here, to find out the truth." Mark's eyes softened as he processed her words. "You said her name is Lily." "Yes," Marianne replied. "Does she look like me?" "She has your eyes," Marianne admitted, her voice trembling. "And your determination, I think." Mark smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through his hardened exterior. "I'd like to meet her one day, if you'd let me." Marianne hesitated. "I don't know yet, but if you're innocent, I'll do everything I can to help." As Marianne left the prison, her emotions were a chaotic swirl of doubt, hope, and fear. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to surface, but the picture was far from complete. She glanced at her phone, where a picture of Lily smiled back at her from the lock screen. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, "no matter how long it takes." Threads of doubt. The wind howled outside as Marianne sat at her kitchen table, a mug of untouched tea growing cold beside her. She stared at the thick folder James had delivered that morning, filled with documents and photos about Mark Dawson's case. Each page told a story that left her questioning everything she thought she knew, not just about Mark, but about the justice system, the fertility clinic, and her own sense of security. The headlines had painted him as a monster, but the evidence suggested otherwise. There was no physical proof linking Mark to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA. The sole eyewitness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen Mark near the crime scene, had recanted their testimony before the trial but was pressured to testify anyway. The murder weapon was never found, and the timeline the prosecution presented was riddled with inconsistencies. What struck Marianne the most was the man she had met at the prison. Mark Dawson didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one. He had been calm, polite, and genuinely stunned by the revelation about Lily. She couldn't ignore the pang of doubt growing in her chest. What if he's innocent? The fertility clinic's secrets. James had also dug deeper into the fertility clinic. It wasn't just the mix-up with Lily's conception. There were whispers of other mistakes, other families whose lives had been quietly appended. Most were silenced with hefty settlements and non-disclosure agreements. James suspected that Marianne's case was the tip of a very large iceberg. Marianne called him late that evening, her voice trembling with urgency. "James, how deep does this go? Are there more families like mine?" James sighed on the other end of the line. "I believe so. The clinic has a history of cutting corners. They've been flagged by regulators in the past, but their lawyers always manage to sweep things under the rug. It's a game of money and power." Marianne tightened her grip on the phone. "What about the temporary technician? The one who worked there during my treatment?" "I tracked him down," James replied. "His name is Daniel Weaver. He's no longer in the industry, but he might be willing to talk. Are you ready for what he might say?" Marianne's heart pounded. "I have to know the truth." Meeting the technician. The next day, Marianne found herself in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Daniel Weaver arrived late, looking disheveled and nervous. His eyes darted around the room as if he expected someone to jump out and accuse him at any moment. "Mrs. Green?" he asked, his voice shaky. Marianne nodded and gestured for him to sit. "Thank you for meeting me." Daniel fidgeted with his coffee cup, avoiding her gaze. "I don't usually talk about my time at that clinic. It's not my proudest chapter." "I need to understand what happened," Marianne said softly. "I'm not here to judge you. I just want answers. For my daughter." Daniel sighed heavily, finally meeting her eyes. "It was chaos there. They brought me in to cover for someone on leave. I had minimal training, and they were running us ragged. Samples weren't properly labeled. Protocols were skipped. It was a mess." Marianne's stomach churned. "Do you remember anything about my case specifically? The date of my treatment?" Daniel hesitated, then pulled out a small notebook from his jacket. "I kept this, just in case. I didn't trust them. They were too eager to blame the staff for their own mistakes." He flipped through the pages until he found the date in question. "Here, I noted an issue with mislabeled samples. There was a delay in processing because 2 sets of samples got mixed up. I flagged it to the supervisor, but they told me to move on." Marianne's hands trembled as she read his notes. "Do you remember the names on the samples?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but there's a code written here." He pointed to a string of numbers and letters in his notebook. "If you can access their system, this should match the records." Marianne's mind raced. "You're saying the clinic knew about this and did nothing?" Daniel nodded grimly. "They were more worried about their reputation than the families they were supposed to help." A break in the case. That evening, Marianne shared Daniel's information with James. He promised to use the code to request additional records through legal channels. "This is big," James said. "If we can prove negligence on their part, it won't just validate your case, it could help others too." Marianne felt a flicker of hope. "And Mark? Will it help him?" James paused. "Potentially. If the mix-up is tied to systemic failures at the clinic, it could add weight to his claims of innocence. But we need more." A mother's dilemma. As the days passed, Marianne found herself caught between 2 battles. On one side was the fight for truth and justice, for Lily, for Mark, and for all the families impacted by the clinic's negligence. On the other was her personal struggle to rebuild her life and protect her daughter from the chaos threatening to engulf them. One evening, as she rocked Lily to sleep, Marianne felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Could she risk exposing her daughter to the media frenzy that would surely follow if this story went public? Could she live with herself if she didn't fight for the truth? Lily stirred in her arms, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp Marianne's finger. The simple gesture brought tears to her eyes. "I'll protect you," Marianne whispered, "no matter what it takes." The prison meeting. A week later, Marianne returned to the prison to meet Mark Dawson. This time, she brought James with her. They sat across from Mark in the same sterile room, separated by the same plexiglass barrier. Mark's expression was a mix of hope and exhaustion. "Did you find anything?" James spoke first. "We're making progress. There's clear evidence of negligence at the clinic. We're also looking deeper into your case. The witness who testified against you is willing to recant." Mark's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" James nodded. "It's not a guarantee, but it's a start. The more we uncover, the stronger your case becomes." Mark turned to Marianne. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Marianne met his gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because Lily deserves to know where she came from. The real story." Mark's voice broke slightly. "Thank you for believing in me, for fighting when no one else would." The next step. As Marianne drove home that night, she felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. She glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror, fast asleep in her car seat. "We're going to figure this out," she said softly. "For you, for him, for all of us." Cracks in the system. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the streets as Marianne parked her car in front of James Howard's office. The folder Daniel Weaver had given her was still tucked under her arm, its contents a stark reminder of how easily lives could be derailed by negligence and greed. Inside, James was already waiting for her, a spread of papers, photos, and notes covering the conference table. His typically calm demeanor was tinged with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said, motioning for Marianne to sit. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. James tapped on a stack of documents. "I followed the lead from Daniel's notes. The code he gave us is tied to an internal incident report from the clinic. It's not in their public records. They buried it in a private server. But through a contact, I was able to access it." Marianne leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What does it say?" "It confirms a sample mix-up on the exact date of your procedure," James explained, "and it implicates the temporary technician as part of the issue, though not entirely his fault. He flagged the problem. But the supervisor overrode the report and ordered the samples to be processed without proper verification." Marianne's stomach churned. "So, they knew." James nodded. "They knew, and they covered it up." Taking action. The evidence was damning, but Marianne knew it wasn't enough. She needed to decide how far she was willing to go. If they exposed the clinic, it could spark a media frenzy, not just for her but for Lily. The idea of reporters digging into their lives made her chest tighten with anxiety. But the alternative, staying silent, felt like a betrayal of the truth. Other families could be affected. Other children might grow up with unanswered questions. "I need to think about Lily," Marianne said softly, breaking the silence. James leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're right to be cautious, but sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that matter most." Marianne looked at the papers spread across the table. "If we do this, I need to protect her. She's my first priority." "We'll control the narrative," James assured her. "If it comes to a legal battle, we'll shield your identity as much as possible." "But Marianne," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone the clinic has failed." Mark's revelation. Later that week, Marianne returned to the prison to update Mark Dawson. The room felt colder than before, and the plexiglass barrier seemed thicker. Mark's face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice tight with hope. Marianne nodded. "We confirmed the mix-up. The clinic buried the evidence, but James found it. This wasn't your fault." Mark exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. That's incredible. But what does it mean for me? For Lily?" Marianne hesitated. "We're still figuring that out. But I wanted you to know. This fight isn't over. Mark studied her for a long moment, his expression softening. You're doing more for me than anyone else ever has. Why? Marianne's voice faltered. Because it's the right thing to do, and because Lily deserves to know the truth about where she came from. Mark smiled faintly. You're stronger than most people I've met, and I've met a lot of people in here. The witness. As Marianne and James prepared their case, a new lead emerged. The key witness in Mark's trial, a man named Caleb Murphy, had agreed to speak with them. Caleb's testimony had been the linchpin in the prosecution's case, placing Mark at the scene of the crime. But years later, the cracks in his story had begun to show. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a small cafe on the edge of town. Marianne arrived first, clutching her coffee like a lifeline. Caleb was late, and when he finally walked in, she was struck by how haunted he looked. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Mr. Murphy?" Marianne asked, standing to greet him. He nodded, shaking her hand with a grip that was too firm, as if trying to steady himself. "I don't know why I agreed to this," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Because it's the right thing to do," Marianne replied, echoing her own words to Mark. Caleb sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "I lied at the trial," he admitted. "The cops said they had enough to pin it on Mark, but they needed me to seal the deal. They told me I'd lose my job if I didn't cooperate. So I did." Marianne's chest tightened. "And now?" "I've been living with that guilt for years," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "I've wanted to come clean, but I didn't know how, or if it would even matter." "It matters," Marianne said firmly. "To Mark, to Lily, to everyone who's been hurt by this." Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll testify, whatever it takes to make it right." A shifting landscape. With Caleb's confession, the case against the clinic and Mark Dawson gained new momentum. James worked tirelessly to build a comprehensive argument, connecting the dots between the clinic's negligence and the miscarriage of justice in Mark's trial. But as the case grew stronger, so did the opposition. The clinic's lawyers filed motions to dismiss the evidence, arguing that it was inadmissible. Mark's original prosecutor publicly doubled down on their claims, insisting that the conviction was sound. And then the media got wind of the story. The media frenzy. Marianne woke one morning to find reporters camped outside her house, cameras and microphones at the ready. She felt a surge of panic as she peered through the curtains, clutching Lily tightly. "Marianne Green," one reporter shouted, "is it true your daughter is connected to Mark Dawson, the convicted murderer?" "Do you believe he's innocent?" another asked. Marianne stepped back, her heart racing. She had prepared for this possibility, but the reality was far more overwhelming than she'd imagined. James arrived an hour later, ushering Marianne and Lily into his car. "We'll stay at a safe house for now," he said. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." The next step. As Marianne settled into the temporary apartment James had arranged, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The world was watching now. The pressure was immense, but so was the potential for change. She sat at the small kitchen table, Lily asleep in a travel crib nearby, and opened her laptop. She began drafting a statement, a message to the world that would lay everything bare. When she finished, she read it aloud to herself, her voice steady. "This is not just my story. It's the story of every family who has ever been let down by the systems meant to protect them. It's about truth, justice, and the lengths we go to for the people we love. I will fight for my daughter. I will fight for Mark Dawson. And I will fight for every person whose voice has been silenced. This is just the beginning." The weight of truth. Marianne stood at the window of the small apartment James had secured for her, staring at the muted skyline as the early morning sun fought its way through a layer of gray clouds. She cradled Lily in her arms, the baby's soft breath warm against her neck. The noise of reporters and cameras outside the building had dulled overnight, but Marianne knew it was only temporary. The media frenzy surrounding her and Mark's case wasn't going away anytime soon. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She hesitated before answering, recognizing the number as James. "Morning," she said, her voice weary. "Marianne, we got a development," James replied. "The clinic's lawyers have filed a countersuit, claiming defamation. They're saying your allegations are baseless and that you're trying to damage their reputation for personal gain." Marianne felt a surge of anger. How can they accuse me of lying? We have proof, documents, witness testimony. What more do they want? "They're trying to scare you into silence," James said calmly. "It's a common tactic, but we're not backing down." Marianne looked down at Lily, her daughter's tiny fingers clutching the edge of her sweater. "What's our next move?" "I've scheduled a press conference," James said. "It's time to take control of the narrative. If we show the public what we have, everything we've uncovered, they'll have no choice but to listen." The press conference. The press conference was held in a small conference room at a downtown hotel. Reporters filled every seat, cameras lined the back wall, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the air as Marianne entered with James and Olivia Grant, the lawyer representing Mark Dawson. Marianne wore a simple black dress and a silver locket containing a picture of Lily, a reminder of who she was fighting for. She felt the weight of every eye in the room as she stepped up to the podium. James spoke first, laying out the facts: the fertility clinic's history of negligence, the evidence uncovered by Daniel Weaver, and the DNA results that prove the mix-up. He ended with a declaration. "This isn't just about one family. It's about holding a system accountable, a system that values profit over human lives." Then it was Marianne's turn. She took a deep breath and gripped the edges of the podium, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "My name is Marianne Green," she began. "I came to the Riverside Fertility Clinic because I believed in their promise to help families like mine. My husband and I had struggled with infertility for years, and we saw this clinic as our last hope." She paused, her throat tightening. "But that hope turned into a nightmare. A mistake they tried to cover up has left me a single mother, fighting to protect my daughter from a world that questions her very existence. And now, I've learned that the man whose DNA was used without his knowledge is serving a life sentence for a crime he may not have committed." Gasps rippled through the room. "I'm not here for revenge," Marianne continued. "I'm here for accountability, for answers, for justice. Not just for me, but for every family who has been hurt by negligence and greed." She held up a stack of papers, the clinic's internal documents that James had uncovered. "These are their mistakes. These are their lies. And I won't let them hide anymore." The room erupted in questions, but Marianne stepped back, letting James and Olivia handle the chaos. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Mark's retrial. As the media turned its focus on the fertility clinic, momentum built for Mark Dawson's case. Olivia Grant had filed a motion for a retrial, and the court had agreed to hear it, citing the new evidence as grounds for reconsideration. Marianne attended every hearing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom as Olivia dismantled the original case piece by piece. She watched as Caleb Murphy testified, his voice trembling as he admitted to lying on the stand all those years ago. "They told me what to say," Caleb said, his eyes brimming with regret. "I was scared. I thought I didn't have a choice. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The prosecution tried to paint Caleb as unreliable, but Olivia was relentless, pointing out the inconsistencies in the original investigation and the lack of physical evidence linking Mark to the crime. When the judge finally ruled that Mark's conviction would be overturned and that he was to be released immediately, the courtroom erupted in applause. Marianne found herself crying, not just for Mark, but for Lily, and for the truth that had finally come to light. A fragile reunion. Mark's first moments of freedom were bittersweet. The world he had left behind had changed, and he struggled to adjust to life outside the prison walls. Marianne invited him to her home for dinner, a few days after his release, wanting to give him a chance to meet Lily in a quiet, private setting. Mark sat at the dining table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked at Lily, who sat in her high chair, babbling happily as she smeared mashed carrots across her face. "She's beautiful," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's yours," Marianne said softly. Mark reached out tentatively, his hand trembling as he brushed Lily's tiny fingers. The baby giggled, and Mark's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile Marianne had seen from him. "I don't even know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've missed so much." Marianne placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's not too late. You're here now. That's what matters." The fight continues. While Mark adjusted to his new life, Marianne continued her fight against the fertility clinic. The media coverage had sparked a wave of outrage, with other families coming forward to share their own stories of negligence and heartbreak. James and Olivia worked tirelessly to build a class action lawsuit, and Marianne became the reluctant face of the movement. She gave interviews, attended rallies, and met with lawmakers to push for stricter regulations on fertility clinics. Through it all, she remained grounded by the love she had for Lily and the bond she had formed with Mark. One evening, as the three of them sat on the living room floor playing with Lily, Mark looked at Marianne and said, "I don't know where I'd be without you. You saved my life." Marianne smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "We saved each other." Building bridges. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine through the open windows of Marianne's small home. The soft hum of crickets filled the silence as she and Mark sat across from each other at the dining table. Lily, now asleep in her crib, left the two of them alone to navigate the delicate threads of their evolving relationship. Mark stared at his hands, his rough fingers tracing the edge of the mug of tea Marianne had set before him. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice low. 13 years in prison. You don't just come back from that. And now, finding out about Lily, it's like the world flipped upside down." Marianne studied him, noticing the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if he were still bracing himself for the weight of invisible chains. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said gently. "We'll take it one step at a time." Mark nodded, though his expression remained clouded. "I missed her first laugh, her first steps. I wasn't there for any of it. How do I make up for that?" "You don't," Marianne said, her voice firm but kind. "You start from here. Lily doesn't know what she's missed. She just knows she's loved. And now she gets to have you in her life." Mark's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Maybe not," Marianne said, surprising him. "But Lily does. And so do I. We're all trying to rebuild, Mark. You're not alone in this." The clinic's counterattack. Meanwhile, the fertility clinic's lawyers doubled down on their efforts to discredit Marianne and James's findings. They issued public statements denying any wrongdoing, accusing Marianne of fabricating evidence to gain attention and sympathy. Their legal team filed a motion to suppress the documents Marianne had obtained, arguing that they were illegally obtained and therefore inadmissible. James called Marianne late one night to discuss the latest developments. "They're playing hardball," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They're trying to drown us in legal red tape." Marianne sighed, leaning against the counter as she balanced the phone on her shoulder. "What do we do?" "We push back," James replied. "But it's going to get ugly. They're already digging into your background, looking for anything they can use against you. Be prepared." Marianne felt a chill run down her spine. What could they possibly find? "Probably nothing," James said quickly. "But that won't stop them from trying. Stay strong, Marianne. We've come too far to back down now." The media storm. The next morning, Marianne woke to a flurry of missed calls and text messages. Her heart sank as she opened a link sent by a friend. The headline read, Single mother fights fertility clinic over alleged negligence, but is she hiding the full story? The article was a thinly veiled attack on Marianne's character, questioning her motives and even hinting at her relationship with Mark Dawson. Photos of her leaving the prison after visiting Mark were splashed across the page, accompanied by speculation about her intentions. Marianne's hands trembled as she read the comments section. Why would she visit a convicted murderer? Something doesn't add up. Looks like she's just after money. Feel bad for the kid. She's stuck in the middle of this mess. Tears welled in Marianne's eyes, but she forced herself to keep reading. She had to know what they were saying, even if it hurt. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Olivia Grant. "Marianne, don't let this get to you," Olivia said firmly. "This is exactly what the clinic wants, to paint you as unreliable, to make you question yourself. But we have the truth on our side. Don't forget that." Marianne nodded, even though Olivia couldn't see her. "I won't." A community rises. Despite the attacks, support began to pour in from unexpected places. Families who had been wronged by the clinic reached out, sharing their own stories of heartbreak and betrayal. Some sent letters of encouragement, while others offered to testify in court. One letter stood out. It came from a woman named Angela, whose son had been conceived at the same clinic. "Dear Marianne, I know how hard this fight must be. My family went through something similar. Our son was born with a rare genetic disorder that neither my husband nor I carried. We later found out that the clinic had used a donor sample without informing us. They offered us money to stay quiet, but we refused. Your story has given me the courage to speak up. You're not alone in this. With gratitude, Angela and family." Marianne read the letter 3 times, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and determination. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a pattern, and she was part of a growing movement to expose the truth. A turning point. As the pressure mounted, James and Olivia arranged a meeting with the clinic's legal team to discuss a potential settlement. Marianne, initially hesitant, agreed to attend. She wanted to see the people who had caused so much pain face to face. The meeting took place in a sleek conference room at the clinic's headquarters. The clinic's lawyers sat across the table, their expressions cold and calculating. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Linda Shaw, wasted no time getting to the point. "We're prepared to offer a settlement," Linda said, sliding a document across the table. "In exchange for dropping your claims, we'll compensate you generously and ensure this matter remains confidential." Marianne picked up the document, scanning the terms. The settlement amount was staggering, enough to secure Lily's future and more. But the non-disclosure agreement felt like a noose tightening around her neck. "Confidentiality," Marianne said slowly. "That's what you're really paying for, isn't it? To keep your mistakes hidden." Linda's expression didn't waver. "We're offering you a chance to move on. Take it." Marianne looked at James, then Olivia. Both of them gave her a subtle nod, silently affirming that the decision was hers. She pushed the document back across the table. "No." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Marianne repeated. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled under the table. "This isn't just about me. It's about every family you've hurt. I won't be silenced." Linda's composed facade cracked for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Then we'll see you in court." Marianne stood, her heart racing. "I'll see you there." The ripple effect. As Marianne left the building, she felt a strange sense of calm. She had turned down security and comfort for something much greater, the chance to make a difference. Later that night, as she sat in Lily's room watching her daughter sleep, Marianne felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, brushing a hand over Lily's soft curls. "No matter what happens, we'll be okay." Triumph through shadows. The courthouse stood tall and unyielding against the pale gray sky, its stone facade a solemn reminder of the stakes. Marianne adjusted her blazer as she climbed the steps, clutching a folder of documents close to her chest. She could hear the hum of reporters just beyond the barriers, their questions a distant roar in her ears. Marianne, do you think you'll win? Is it true you rejected a multi-million-dollar settlement? What about Mark Dawson? Is he involved in the case? She ignored the barrage of questions, focusing instead on the day ahead. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about accountability, justice, and giving Lily a future unmarred by secrecy and lies. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the proceedings began. Marianne sat beside James and Olivia, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, the fertility clinic's legal team appeared as confident as ever, led by the razor-sharp Linda Shaw. The first few days of testimony were grueling. The clinic's lawyers attempted to undermine Marianne's credibility, painting her as an opportunist seeking attention and financial gain. They questioned her motives for going public and even brought up her visits to Mark Dawson, implying that her association with a convicted felon made her unreliable. Olivia was relentless in her cross-examinations, methodically dismantling their arguments. She introduced evidence from Daniel Weaver's notebook, Caleb Murphy's confession, and the clinic's own internal documents, which James had painstakingly unearthed. The turning point came when Olivia called Marianne to the stand. Marianne's testimony. Marianne took a deep breath as she was sworn in, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew this was her moment to speak her truth, not just for herself but for Lily, for Mark, and for every family who had been failed by the system. Mrs. Green, Olivia began, her tone steady and reassuring. Can you tell the court why you decided to bring this case forward? Marianne nodded, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as she spoke. I trusted the Riverside Fertility Clinic to help me start a family. When my husband and I finally had our daughter, we thought our struggles were over. But then my world fell apart. My husband left me, accusing me of infidelity. And when I finally found the courage to take a DNA test, I discovered that my daughter's biological father was a man I had never met, a man who had been convicted of murder. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a stone in a still pond. I could have stayed quiet, Marianne continued. I could have taken their settlement and moved on. But how many other families have been hurt by their negligence? How many other children might grow up with unanswered questions? I couldn't live with myself if I didn't fight for the truth. Linda Shaw rose for the cross-examination, her tone icy. Mrs. Green, you've said this isn't about money, but you turned down a substantial settlement. Why? Because money doesn't fix this, Marianne said firmly. It doesn't erase the pain, the betrayal, or the uncertainty. This is about accountability. Linda's lips tightened, but she moved on. You've also maintained contact with Mark Dawson, a convicted murderer. Don't you think that raises questions about your judgment? Marianne met Linda's gaze without flinching. Mark Dawson's conviction is being overturned because new evidence proves he was wrongfully accused. And even if it weren't, he's Lily's biological father. She deserves to know where she came from. Linda's sharp retorts faltered under Marianne's calm determination. By the time Marianne stepped down from the stand, the courtroom felt heavier, the tide visibly turning. Mark's testimony. The next day, Mark Dawson took the stand. It was his first public appearance since his release, and the weight of 13 years of wrongful imprisonment seemed to hang over him like a shadow. He spoke about his life before the conviction, his unwavering claims of innocence, and the moment he learned he was Lily's biological father. I lost everything, Mark said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. My freedom, my reputation, my family. But when I found out about Lily, it gave me something to hold on to. I want to be there for her, to do right by her. Linda Shaw tried to rattle him, bringing up his past and the original conviction, but Mark held firm. I didn't do what they said I did, he said. And now we have the proof. I'm here to fight, not just for myself, but for my daughter. A verdict and a victory. The final day of the trial was electric with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, and the air felt charged as the judge entered to deliver the verdict. Marianne held her breath, her hands gripping James's arm for support. After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented, the judge began. It is clear that the Riverside Fertility Clinic demonstrated gross negligence in its handling of patient samples. Their actions caused irreparable harm to the plaintiff and her family. Marianne's heart leaped, tears spilling down her cheeks as the judge continued. The court awarded significant damages, but more importantly, the clinic was ordered to overhaul its procedures, submit to independent oversight, and publicly acknowledge its failures. As the judge concluded, Marianne felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The battle had been long and grueling, but the truth had finally prevailed. Healing and new beginnings. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The media frenzy died down, and Marianne found solace in the quiet moments with Lily. She and Mark started to rebuild their lives, slowly forming a co-parenting partnership that balanced trust with cautious optimism. One sunny afternoon, they visited the park together, watching as Lily toddled through the grass, her laughter ringing out like music. Mark crouched down to her level, holding out his hands as she wobbled toward him. "You've got this, Lily," he said, his smile broad and genuine. Marianne stood nearby, her heart full. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed bright. The legacy. Marianne's case became a landmark moment, inspiring others to come forward and demand accountability from institutions that had long operated in the shadows. Laws were passed to tighten regulations on fertility clinics, ensuring that no family would have to endure what she had. Through it all, Marianne remained steadfast in her mission to turn pain into purpose. She founded an organization to support families affected by fertility clinic negligence, working tirelessly to amplify their voices. One evening, as Marianne tucked Lily into bed, she kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "You're my reason for everything." The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but Marianne had learned that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth and love could shine through. A journey completed. The following weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, interviews, and quiet moments of reflection. Marianne found herself standing at the intersection of the past and the future, with Lily as her anchor through it all. The media had finally moved on, and the reporters who had once camped outside her home disappeared. For the first time in months, life felt almost normal. But normal was different now. Marianne had grown in ways she never anticipated, stronger, more resolute, and determined to use her experience to create change. Mark's new chapter. Mark Dawson was a free man, but freedom came with its own challenges. Adjusting to life outside prison wasn't easy. Simple things like choosing groceries or walking through a crowded street felt overwhelming. Marianne did what she could to support him, inviting him to spend time with Lily and easing him into the rhythm of their little family. One evening, as they sat in her backyard watching Lily toddle through the grass, Mark broke the silence. "I still don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You didn't have to believe in me, but you did." Marianne smiled softly, her gaze on Lily. "You don't have to thank me. This wasn't just about you. It was about doing what's right. And it was about her." She nodded toward Lily, who had just discovered a dandelion and was blowing its seeds into the wind. Mark leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. "She's amazing." "She is," Marianne agreed. "And she's lucky to have you in her life." A ripple effect. Marianne's case against the fertility clinic sparked a wave of change. Families who had stayed silent out of fear of legal retaliation began to speak up. Angela, the mother who had written to Marianne, became one of her closest allies, helping to organize a support group for families impacted by similar negligence. Together, they lobbied for new regulations, ensuring stricter oversight of fertility clinics nationwide. Politicians took notice, and Marianne was invited to testify before Congress about her experience. It was a surreal moment, standing in front of lawmakers and sharing her story. but she spoke with the same clarity and conviction that had carried her through the trial. "This isn't just about my family," she said, her voice steady. "It's about protecting every family, every child, and ensuring no one else has to endure the pain and uncertainty that we did." Her testimony was met with a standing ovation. A quiet victory. Months later, Marianne received a letter from the fertility clinic. It wasn't an apology. It was too carefully worded for that, but it was an acknowledgement of their failure. They admitted to negligence and outlined the changes they were implementing as part of their court-mandated reforms. Marianne placed the letter in a box she kept in her closet, a box filled with mementos from her journey, photos, court documents, and Lily's first drawing. It wasn't just a box of memories. It was a testament to resilience and truth. Family ties. One sunny afternoon, Marianne and Mark drove to a modest home on the outskirts of town. Inside lived Elena Martinez, the daughter Mark had been separated from for so many years. With the help of James, they had tracked her down, and after months of careful communication, Elena had agreed to meet her biological father. The door opened, and a young woman with Mark's piercing blue eyes and a cautious smile stepped out. Mark froze, emotion flickering across his face, but Marianne gave him a gentle nudge forward. "Hi, Elena," Mark said, his voice cracking. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft but warm. "I've been waiting to meet you." The meeting was tentative at first, but as they sat together in the living room, sharing stories and laughter, the barriers between them began to fade. Marianne watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride and relief. Mark was finally reclaiming the pieces of his life that had been stolen from him. Looking forward, that night, back at home, Marianne stood by Lily's crib, watching her daughter sleep. The moonlight cast a soft glow across the room, illuminating the stuffed animals and colorful drawings that adorned the walls. Mark appeared in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything. About what's next." Marianne turned to him, curious. "And I want to do something with all of this," Mark said, gesturing broadly. "The time I lost, the lessons I've learned. I want to help other people who've been wrongfully convicted. People who didn't have someone like you to fight for them." Marianne smiled. "You'd be good at that." Mark nodded. "It feels like the right thing to do. A new beginning." The next morning, as the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, Marianne, Mark, and Lily walked hand in hand to the park. Lily squealed with delight as she ran toward the swings, her laughter filling the crisp morning air. Marianne sat on a bench, watching Mark push Lily on the swing, her tiny legs kicking excitedly. The scene felt almost surreal, a stark contrast to the chaos and uncertainty of the past year. As the swing rose higher, Lily's laughter echoing like music, Marianne felt a deep sense of peace. They had been through so much, pain, loss, and heartache, but they had come out the other side stronger, bound together by love and truth. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Epilogue. Years later, Marianne stood in the audience at a gala fundraiser for the Innocence Project, an organization Mark had helped expand. He stood on stage, sharing his story with a room full of supporters. Beside him, Elena and Lily beamed with pride, their bond as sisters now unbreakable. Marianne watched as Mark's voice resonated through the hall, his words filled with hope and determination. He had turned his pain into purpose, just as she had. Together, they had built something meaningful, a legacy of truth, resilience, and love. As the crowd erupted into applause, Marianne felt a tear slip down her cheek. She glanced at Lily, now a teenager, who leaned over and whispered, "We did it, Mom." "Yes, we did," Marianne replied, her heart full. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that their story, their journey, had truly found its ending.